Good evening. My name is Fia Lems. I'm the Associate Curator of Public Programs at Riboca 2 and Suddenly It All Blossoms, and it's my pleasure welcoming you to our online series of talks and conversations, this week dedicated to the importance of the imagination. As you might know, our glossary involves manifold perspectives coming at the possibility of living more desirable futures. Reality today seems indeed to be abandoned by imagination. Following the daily news reports is a tiring experience. The apocalyptic narratives that accompany environmental change, the historically situated political violence, the seemingly unending spread of a virus that we will have to eventually learn to live with. Yet, against the deluge of hopeless narratives, art and ideas continue to pave ways of imagining forward. What roles can art and the imagination play in supporting radical transformation? I'm pleased to introduce Emeritus Professor Tim Ingold, whose writing, research, and teaching explore the connections between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture, conceived as ways of probing the relations between human beings and the environments they inhabit. Over the years, Tim has written on the role of the imagination and is now preparing a new monograph titled Imagine the Real, out in 2021, of which today's talk introduces some of its major concerns. Against the idea that finite futures are coming at us, particularly for the youngest, Tim's talk instead proposes a return to futures that extend infinitely onwards. He will discuss how imagination and memory coalesce in a temporal register that is beyond the now into more enduring rhythms of time. Dear Tim, thank you so much for connecting with us today and for sharing your reflections.
Right, well, the ideas I want to present are ones that have come to me quite recently. I haven't really presented them before, and partly as a result of what everybody's going through at the moment. So I got a talk here called The Young, the Old, and the Generation of Now. And it starts from the experience that many of us have, and I've had myself, that one of the most painful parts of having to be locked down during the current pandemic has been the impossibility for grandparents to meet their grandchildren. And the simple lack of immediate bodily contact between people of alternate generations, the rather old and the very young. They've not, until recently, in many countries, they've not been able to meet one another or visit one another. They've only seen each other on screens. And this has been really painful, both for grandparents and for grandchildren. And I speak from experience because I'm a grandparent myself, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing my grandchildren next week after a gap of almost 4 months. But this separation of the older generation, or much older generation, from the much younger generation is not a new thing. It's been around in our society societies for a long time, and the restrictions imposed by the pandemic have, in a sense, nearly exacerbated what already existed as a problem. The problem is that somehow it seems as though a wedge has been driven between the senior generation and the junior generation. And that wedge is the generation in between, the intermediate generation. So we tend to think of our societies as made up of the 3 generations. There's the young, who are still growing up, waiting, developing the knowledge to enter into society. They're the old, who've done their bit and have sort of passed it and have simply left to fade away. And then they're the people in the middle who are doing things. They're the people who are world makers, who are shaping the future. And so, because the intermediate generation has thrust its way in between the young and the old, that has split those senior and junior generations apart. And it sometimes seems that these world makers, these intermediate world makers, are so busy with their world making, they're so preoccupied with the affairs of the day, that they pay rather little regard to their elders and their juniors. So that from the point of view of this intermediate generation, old people have sort of already had their place in the sun. They've already been somebody, and now they should simply fade away gracefully into years of decline. And young people, well, they're the people who need to be brought up to speed, educated into society in order to face the future that's already prepared for them. And it's quite interesting that we use this phrase, face the future. It's as though it's actually facing you. As I'm looking at this screen here, there's me and I'm looking at it. So the future seems to be something already there that is coming towards us. It's not something that extends infinitely in depth beyond horizons. It's something that is, in a sense, coming towards us. And there's a pervasive anxiety at the moment, I think, because we feel that this future is coming closer and closer, if perhaps it's already reached us. And it's like a string that's getting shorter and shorter. And as the string gets shorter and shorter, it vibrates more and more quickly and makes a higher and higher sound. And it's that sense that at the moment, I think, of mounting anxiety as this future comes towards us and the vibration of the string reaches an ever higher pitch. But from the point of view of the intermediate generation, what I'm calling the generation of now, life is shaped rather like a bell curve. So it rises with age, then reaches the peak in the middle, and then fades off again towards the end. But the paradox is that if this generation of now is to make a world, to make a future for the next, then it has to unmake whatever has been made before. It can't simply accept what the previous generation has made for it. I mean, if every generation made the future for the next generation would have nothing to do, or would be unable to create a future of their own. And the only way they can do it is by destroying the previous future, or by covering it up, or burying it, so that they can then impose a layer of their own construction. So we tend to think of generations following one another like layers in succession, one layer over another layer over another layer. So the current generation of now is imposing its layer over the layer that the previous generation of now, who are now old people, laid, and turn laid it over the ones that their predecessors laid. So it seems as though with passing generation, its predecessors' designs for the future crumble into dust, while its successor, in turn, is equally bound to bury the future made for it. So we add layer upon layer upon layer. And if perhaps sometimes we preserve objects from previous layers, or perhaps dig them up through an excavation, then these things are preserved as antiques, preserved in a museum. So this no longer has any role to play in the present. And in a way, every such object is a prediction, and all predictions fail. This is also the formula of science. I mean, science is supposed to progress through a process of conjecture and refutation. So every conjecture, every hypothesis is eventually disproved. And science is supposed to progress by always moving beyond or refuting what was previously thought. And when we think of generations following each other like that too, we imagine that every generation is laying down its predictions for the future, laying down its designs for the future. And then every generation following it rejects or refutes those designs and puts something else in its place. And indeed they must do, if every generation is to have a future that it can call its own. And yet that kind of serial replacement, in which every generation destroys or covers up what its predecessors did, that surely is hardly a formula for sustainable living. Sustainability, after all, doesn't mean arriving at some final conclusion that will last forever. Sustainability means the possibility for life to carry on, for the river, as it were, to keep on flowing rather than being brought to a halt. And but the successive replacement of futures hardly sounds like a formula for keeping life going, and nor indeed is that inevitable. So I'm suggesting that modernity's vision of progress, which is modeled like science on a history of predictive failure, of futures conjectured only to be refuted, I'm suggesting that that idea of progress is an illusion, a chimera. And the important point is realizing that sustainability is actually incompatible with the doctrine of progressive change. We can't at one and the same time argue for cumulative progress in which every generation builds upon but also refutes the generation before it, and at the same time argue for a notion of sustainability as a possibility for life to carry on. So we have to face, I think, up to the realization that progress and sustainability are not the same, that they're not even compatible, and that if we actually want life to be sustainable, then we have to in a sense, reject the doctrine of progressive change. But that doesn't mean, rejecting the doctrine of progressive change doesn't mean retrogression. It doesn't mean to say that the only way forward is back. We don't have to, in rejecting progress, say, oh, the only alternative is regression. What we have to do instead is to find a way forward that actually aligns with, rather than cross-cutting, the continuity of life. In other words, we have to think differently about generations. Instead of imagining every generation as being like a layer, and then you're adding layer upon layer, like pages in a book, with each generation adding its own page, we have to think rather, we have to have a different image of generations overlapping, rather like the fibers of a rope. Imagine a rope. It's made out of fibers. It could be of grass or any kind of organic fiber, and the rope is made by taking a bunch of fibers and twisting them, and as you twist, you're continually adding new fibers. And then after you've made each twisted thing, you then twist those twists with one another. But the key thing is that every fiber, every length of grass or whatever you're using is indeed of a finite length. It's only so long. And in the same way, we could say the life of a human being or the life of an animal only lasts so long. Every life has its own particular span. But when you twist the rope, you're continually adding new fibers in as old ones give way. So that although every life has a limited span, the rope itself can continue indefinitely. But the important thing here is that the lives that one's twisting together are laid alongside one another longitudinally, so that if we think in terms of the analogy of the rope, generations are not added one on top of the other, each in its own plane of synchrony, layered upon each other in a diachronic sequence, but rather individuals are continually, their lives are continually overlapping, and they're creating that future through their own overlap. So although no one lives forever, the introduction of new lives as old lives pass means that life can continue without end. And just as when you make a rope, it's the way the fibers twist around one another that gives the rope its tensile strength. So also in life, the old and the young must carry on their lives together to lay an assured path for generations to come. So I wanted you to think of generations not as layers, but as fibers that I want to think of generations as overlapping, like the fibers of a rope, and of the creation of the future lying not in the replacement of one generation by another, but the way in which those fibers then twist around and around one another in the process of life itself. Now, of course, through most of human history, that is exactly how human lives have been lived. That is to say that youngsters have grown up hearing the stories and observing the practices of their elders, discovering the meanings of the stories, and developing skills of practice in the passage of their own experience, and becoming storytellers and practitioners in their turn. And there's lots of evidence of this from anthropology that in storytelling, for example, young people are sitting around listening to their elders tell stories. It's not as though the stories are encoding information that is being transmitted to these youngsters. They're just hearing the stories, and they're good stories, and they don't really know what those stories mean until they find themselves in a situation in life which resembles the one that is told in the story. And then they can see how did things carry on in the story, and they can see from that how to carry on in their own lives. So the meaning of the story is something that is discovered retrospectively as it enters into one's own life experience. And that tends to be the way in which throughout history young people have learned from their elders. They've watched, they've listened, and they've discovered the meanings of what they've seen and heard in the context of dealing with situations in their own life experience. But by and large, and particularly in those societies that we call modern, it's a horrible word, but in so-called modern societies, by and large, this is no longer the case today. This is not how children are learning from their elders. It's rather hard to put one's finger on why this is no longer the case, or what exactly happened. I mean, when and why did every intermediate generation come to see itself as the generation of now? And what fired it with such world-making zeal as to trounce the wisdom of its elders and treat its own children, as we tend to do, as mere creatures of nature, at ground zero of civility, in need of induction into a future that they can have no hand in shaping? I mean, this is something that has happened historically, that we've come to think of children as blank slates, or as merely biological, waiting to have some culture inserted into their heads. This is a modern idea, as is the idea that old people are no longer participants in the forging of the future. So at some point, the rope idea of generations binding around one another as they come and go has been replaced by the layer idea of generations supplanting one another. So just why and how that happens is a very complicated question, and I'm not sure that we even have all the answers for it. But what's for sure is that in the modern world, generation now has very little time for stories or for skills. These stories, it says, are the stuff of tradition. So stories exist or are preserved maybe to entertain the young in enactments of heritage or to indulge the old in flights of nostalgia. So if we bring the young and the old together, it's simply in order that the young should be entertained and the old should have an opportunity to be nostalgic. Now, this generation now, this generation in between, that's sort of spanning, I suppose, from children of secondary school age, going into further or higher education, up to people pre-retirement. So it's quite a large span. But this generation of now is essentially target-driven. It has targets and it's aiming to achieve them. So it has ends and it has means. But the problem it faces all the time, particularly in a capitalist world order, is that the ends are continually expanding, but the means are continually contracting. So that one ends up with a more and more intensive competition. People wanting more and more, but with less and less means to achieve it. And as ends expand, as means contract, then objectives become increasingly short-term. The future becomes ever closer to the present, to the point at which maybe the gap between the present and future has disappeared altogether. So that these short-term objectives, driven by expansive ends and limited means, hold no promise that life can endure beyond the future already in its sights. It may be that the most affluent, the most privileged amongst us, amongst the generation of now, dream of a future that can be all for themselves. They dream of an Earth that is somehow where all the problems of climate change have been resolved by a huge geotechnical fix, or they dream about going off to colonize other planets. But whichever way, these dreams leave the bulk of humanity, which are sort of surplus to requirements, to eke out a living on an irreparably damaged Earth. So these dreams of the future basically allow a small, affluent minority to inherit the Earth, and everybody else can just inhabit what's left of the ruins. So, but I'm arguing that there is only one way then to bring about a world for everyone and everything, and not just now, but indefinitely, and that is to loosen the grip of the intermediate generation. I just want to say, to emphasize this point about sustainability being for everyone and everything for all time. It can't be anything else. If we're going to have a sustainable world, it has to be a world that has room for everything and everyone. You cannot have a world that has room only for some to the exclusion of others. So if we're going to imagine a future that is sustainable, it's got to be a future that we can think of as embracing everyone and everything, not just now, but indefinitely. So the question is, can we imagine a society in which the young and the old, who are currently excluded from the tasks of world making, are once again allowed to work alongside one another in forging the conditions of collective life? That, I think, is the key question. And it's a question that has massive implications for the way we think about the wisdom of the elderly, about the curiosity of the young, and about the potential for their collaboration. The thing is that young children and old people have a different sort of relation to time. For the target-driven intermediate generation, time is measured out in intervals. There's the past, the present, and the future, and we're now, and we're heading for this future that is so many years ahead in some measurable chronological time. But children are not thinking about time in that kind of way, and nor are old people. They're not thinking about time as progressing in step-like intervals. They're thinking much more in terms of a time like the flow of a river or like the movements of the weather. Imagine the weather, for example. The weather is changing all the time. In many languages, the words for weather and for time are the same. But the weather is not progressing. It's not moving onwards. It's not forging ahead. It's not going towards a target. But it nevertheless is marking time in its changes, its modulations, its seasonal variations, and so on. And children and old people are much more attuned to these kinds of rhythmic variations in the ongoing becoming of the world than they are to the temporal divisions that mark out past, present, and future according to the generation, the intermediate generation, which is target-driven. And this also affects how we understand imagination. So I come to imagination at last, because for young people and very old people, imagination is not a power of conjecture. It's not a power of trying to represent a future that we imagine up ahead and that we want to get at. Imagination is not a power of representation, and nor is memory the recollection of a past that is already buried. Rather, I claim that for the young and for the very old, imagination and memory coalesce in a beyond that is neither before nor after, but belongs to a quite different temporal register, which is a time not of succession or replacement, but of pure becoming or immanence. And that is what it's like to immerse yourself in the currents of becoming of the world, in the weather. And for many non-human animals, of course, that is exactly what they're doing. They're responding all the time to the rhythms of time as they carry on. And in some ways, because you could say that, well, actually, kids and old people are rather like non-human animals in that respect, and that makes them rather superior in many ways to the target-driven humans who are driven only by immediate objectives. So with young people and old people, we are introducing a different register of time, a time of becoming, or I would call it a time of longing. I very much like this word, to long for things. So what's really interesting about longing for things is that it's impossible to tell whether you're longing for something that was long ago in the past, or whether you're longing something that might be coming up in the future. Actually, in longing, when you long for something, the difference between past and future disappears. There's once I describe an experiment that we did once with a mathematical colleague, Ricardo Nemirovsky, who was visiting our department, and he was interested in the way we experience conic sections, and he got us to lay out a rope on a football field, a long rope in a football field, and precisely measured out so the rope took the form of a parabola. And then he asked us to hold up a plastic sheet of perspex to our eyes, and with a felt pen to draw a line on the perspex where we saw a rope, where we saw the line of the rope. And then we looked at what we had drawn, and we discovered that we had drawn an ellipse. Because actually, and this is how conic sections work, right on the horizon, the two ends of the parabola actually meet up. And it's the same with longing, that in a way, when we long for things that are at or beyond the horizon of conceptualization, the past and the future join up. So to long for things is not to plan for the future or to wish back the past, but to live on the cusp. And that entails an openness to a world that is not already formed, but is always incipient, or with just on the point of showing itself for what it is. And it entails an attentiveness to what is going on in that world. And we could say that in openness lies curiosity, and in attentiveness lies wisdom. So we have curiosity and wisdom, the curiosity of the young and the wisdom of the old. But neither juvenile curiosity nor seasoned wisdom hold much esteem in a system that values objective knowledge and the operations of abstract reason above all else. And indeed, within the prevailing value system that underlies our institutions of education and social care, which are dedicated respectively for preparing children for a predetermined future and sequestering the elderly for whom this future came too late, the innocence of curiosity is often assessed as a deficiency of knowledge, and the humility of wisdom is assessed as a deficiency of mind. The first is branded as ignorance, the latter as dementia. And for Generation Now, the idea that you might actually bring the ignorant and the demented together to forge the future would be completely ridiculous. You talk to the world shapers and say, well, actually, the way to create a sustainable future is to bring these young kids and these old people in care homes and get them to talk together. They'd say, this is ridiculous. The young people are ignorant. The old people, well, they're demented. How on earth can we create a future by bringing these together? So for Generation Now, that idea is manifestly absurd. However, to unite wisdom and curiosity seems to me not only prudent, but necessary for the renewal of life for generations to come. And that's not nostalgia, it's not hankering for a lost past, nor is it a utopian fantasy for the future. It's rather a foundation for hope. But I want to suggest that to turn hope into reality, then the old and the young must come together again, turning their collaboration into a force of renewal for the common good. And perhaps the tribulations that we're undergoing during this pandemic will serve for us as a forcible reminder of the need to do so. Thank you.
Dear Tim, thank you so much for these thoughts. I suppose the first question to start our conversation: what is the role of the imagination in politically operationalizing this collaborative world-making between the young and the elderly?
Well, we should stop thinking about imagination as a kind of thing that we can bring in. Imagining, let's treat imagination as a verb. So to imagine. Imagining is something that people do. That's the first thing. So it's what you do, it's not a product. It's not a thing. It's a doing. And the second thing is that imagining is something that people do together. It's not something that you do in a solitary way inside your own head. Imagining is a collective task. And as such, imagining is simply an aspect of life. I mean, it's just where life ends and imagining begins, and that's impossible to say. They're almost the same thing. So what, in a way, imagination is a, we have to use this word, but it's not a very good word. I wish we could have another word, and the reason why it's not a very good word is because it has this word image inside it, and it leads us always to suppose that when we're talking about imagination, we're somehow concerned with image making. We're somehow talking about representing states of affairs that are not immediately present before us, and I want to get out of that way of thinking of imagining, and to link it then to this idea of longing. One of the nicest formulations I found of it was by a philosopher called Henri Berthoft, who was very much inspired by the thinking of Goethe. And Bortoft says that grammatically, it might be correct to say it appears, but that philosophically it's better to say appears it. And by that he meant that appearing is about being present at the moment where it actually becomes. That when we say it appears, it's as though the object, is already there, and then we discover it or represent it. But if we say appears it, what it means is that there's something about the way in which we are there at the birth, at the very origination of this world. That the world itself is in continuous birth, and then to imagine is to move upstream to that moment at which things are becoming what they are. And in that sense, we can actually bring perception and imagination together. Imagining is perceiving, but it's a perceiving that moves itself up to put itself at that point at which the world is continually revealing itself, as it were, for the first time. And that's what I want imagining to be. And that's where I think the old and the young can find common ground and imagine together.
We've been witnessing a special moment in the last few years with the rise of the School Strike for Climate movement, through which younger people seem to be gaining agency in the political sphere. Oftentimes, however, political discourse seems to demand from this young generation solutions for the wrongdoings of the generation of now. Could you comment on this?
Yes, it's difficult. It's difficult. I mean, that it is true that the generation that's just coming up, let's say the younger end of the generation of now, or the generation will be just about now, are the ones that have been in a way deputed with the task of clearing up the mess that the previous generation left. And that's really hard, and I don't want to minimize the challenges, but only to say that this is not the first time. Think about the two world wars of the 20th century. So there was a generation that had to clear up the mess after the First World War, and then another generation that had to clear up the mess after the Second World War. And actually, particularly if you think about the things that were achieved in years after the end of the Second World War, some of the greatest social reforms we've seen in terms of public health, housing, and education took place in those years after the end of the Second World War. And there's a lot of that stuff was then destroyed by free market capitalism and neoliberalism from the mid-1970s onwards, and there's a breakdown of that post-war consensus. So then there's another mess then that this coming generation has to clear up. So this perpetual clearing up the mess left by the previous generation now, with each generation thinking that it has the final answers to everything. This is not the first time that a generation has been subjected to this, but we've had sort of just endless succession of construction and ruination, and maybe that's just the way history is. But I think that there must be another way of doing things, and how we achieve that. I really don't know. I don't have a program as to how one could change it. But we do have to, I think, do a very fundamental reassessment of what we mean. We all think education is a good thing, but we need to have a reassessment of what we mean by it, and because education is the way in which societies do create a future for themselves, but we have to think how we're imagining that future. I'm just going back to John Dewey, and John Dewey in Democracy and Education a century ago said that we can't have education without democracy, but by education he meant a sort of conversation in which people come together to collectively fashion the future. And what's happened today is that democracy and education have become pulled apart, so that education has simply become linked with the self-interested perpetuation of a meritocracy, and everybody who's left out of that blames education for their problems and says we are supporting democracy. So that democracy and education have become split apart, and they have to be brought back together again. And to do that, one has to have a different understanding of what democracy means. It's not simply counting heads, or it's not simply the majority defending its interests against the minority. It's actually about conversation and what do you call the achievement of like-mindedness, which can only be achieved through conversation. So we have to imagine democracy differently. We have to imagine education differently. We have to bring those two together, and along with the idea that the old and the young, it's not that the old are simply transferring knowledge to the young, but the old and the young are creating knowledge and a future together. That's what we need to do. Just how we do it is a real problem.
I'd like for us to return to this idea of modernity being built on predictive failure in opposition to presentness and bringing awareness to the emergence of the real, which you mentioned before in relation to the imagination. In other words, our ability to collectively reassess the enduring rhythms of time. Could you comment on the role of art and creativity in connecting the intermediate generation, so the generation of now, in order to foster different ways of being today and future tomorrows?
I do think we need to be very careful about the way we talk about creativity. Unfortunately, there are so many words that are essentially good words that have then been co-opted by the neoliberal machine and turned into something else. And creativity is one of the victims of that process. So it's become a kind of thing that we have that is supposed to be the source of all good things, innovation, and the rest of it. It's a bit the same like with the word production. I mean, to produce and production is fine, but when you turn production into productivity, something has gone wrong. And creation is fine, but if you turn creation into creativity, something has gone wrong. And what's happened is that instead of a world of creation is part of creation is a question of joining in and guiding the processes of a world in continual becoming. As soon as it becomes creativity, that world is turned into a plethora of ends, into commodities. And creativity is about creating more and more novelty rather than allowing the world to renew itself. So what we need is not more novelty, not more innovation. What we need is renewal. And we need the possibility to keep the possibility open for continuous world renewal. And so if we're going to use a word like creation, it has to be that. Or if we're going to use creativity, it has to refer to the potential for world renewal. And as such, it's an ecological thing. It's not something that belongs in the heads of individuals. And then that then has implications for how we understand art, because then we have to think of art too as part of that ecological process of ongoing world renewal. And again, it would be better to turn art into a verb and say that art is actually a sort of way of doing, a way of living, which doesn't have to be restricted to artists or anybody else like that. You might even say that art is an aspect of life, and that it's it refers to the life's capacity or potential for collective renewal. And to artify life is simply to emphasize, place value on that potential. So it might be a question of putting our values in different places, of valuing things that we've not been valuing properly up to now, and that art can help us. It can reactivate our senses and open our eyes to the potential for renewal in life processes.
Tim, so a running thread in the revisionist critique of modern art and the appraisal of the ethnographic and anthropological museums has been linked to the deanimation of the art object. So here, the musealization serves as a process that renders art lifeless, and categorizes it in a torpedo-like, to borrow Alfred Barr's expression, linear narrative of the canon that progresses movement by movement into a gradual withdrawing of mimetic depictions of the world. I could imagine instead the role of art shifting towards a more compost like practice in which matter is metabolized and serves as a fertilizer for the coming generations. So my question here concerns practice, which, like imagination and creativity, have endured shifting views both in architecture, art, and anthropology. So what is the role of practice in the time of longing?
Yeah, it's true that practice is one of those words that just everybody uses because they can't think of anything else to use, and it's become so general it almost means very little. It became important, particularly in around about the 1980s, 90s, when there was at least in like in anthropology, for example, where I come from, there was a big shift in thinking, mostly during the 1980s, from a structural way of thinking to a practice-based way of thinking. And up until then, it was we were supposed to be interested in structures and the way in which these structures dominated everything else. And then suddenly people said, well, actually, we've got people here who are doing things, and these people have a degree of agency, and these structures are not primary, they're not primordial, they're things that are only there because people are continually working at them. And so there was this movement from structure-based thinking to practice-based thinking, and so suddenly practices became center stage, and they've stayed there ever since. We haven't gone back to structuralism, but the notion of practice has become normalized, let's say. Back in the days of structuralism, you wouldn't hear the word practice very often, and it came in as a sort of exception. Now it's just it has become normalized, and I wouldn't want to go back on that. I think it's really important to think about practices, but for me, what's really important is the animacy. The animacy is about life, about giving life to things, and that doesn't mean supposing that objects have a life inside them. It means that those objects themselves have lives and are part of a life process that involves exchanges of materials and energy and everything going on it involves an ecology, basically. So I, in that sense, I'm rather against the move to talk about everything being embodied. I don't like the idea of embodiment because it gives a sense that things sort of sunk in, wrapped up, and actually we're talking about just the opposite. We're talking about the ways in which everything gives out to the world of which it's part, and in that sense, it's more akin to breathing, and that's where I like the idea of animacy, because it gives this notion of breathing, of air, of life, of wind. That those are the things that hold the world together.
One of the important aspects that has been highlighted by the ecological movement is, of course, as you mentioned, how it only encompasses certain lives and certain futures, with most dispossessed communities often lacking the alternatives and the means to carry forward their environmental justice claims. This is clear in movements such as Extinction Rebellion and others further from the spaces where environmental disarray is most imminent. So how might attuning to different relations between children and the elderly in different countries and communities but also understanding the complexities of Indigenous and First Nations peoples' life worlds might inform differently the generation of now.
No, that's really difficult because it's all too easy to romanticize Indigenous people and think of them as ecological natives who somehow had all the solutions, were working in harmony with the world, and if only they'd been left in peace and not destroyed by Western colonization, everything would be fine, and therefore we should go and listen to them because they've got the answers to everything. And of course, the thing is, nobody has the answers. They don't have the answers, nor does anybody else. The answers are things that we have to make collectively. So far as the northern circumpolar people themselves are concerned, the situation for them is fairly disastrous. I mean, their environments are changing very fast. They've never thought of their environments being stable in the first place, but nevertheless, their environments are changing in ways that is very hard for them to deal with, and it's not their fault. They've suffered so much trauma that rates of alcoholism, suicide, violence, domestic abuse are sky high across these communities. It's no lovely place to be. I mean, that these are really, really difficult situations that they're having to live in, and they're doing as well as they can. The important thing is that we should listen. I mean, and that's why I think anthropology is important, because it's the one discipline that is actually prepared to listen to what people have to say and take them seriously. And it doesn't matter who they are, where they live, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, doesn't matter. The important thing is, and you might disagree with them, you might think that they're terrible, but at least you listen. And then if you think, well, I really don't agree with what these people are saying, then you have to explain why. And it's through those sorts of conversations, robust sometimes, that we can collectively fashion some sort of future for ourselves. But the best way to do it is not to impose boundaries where none exist. So I don't think, for example, having long debates about who is an Indigenous person and who isn't helps at all. We need, so far as possible, to break down boundaries rather than erect them.
Tim, as I'm aware of time, I'd like for us to turn to the Baltics. One of the aspects I found fascinating in spending time in Latvia has been understanding people's connections or deep connection to pagan rituals, the natural importance of the summer solstice, for example, the role of mushroom foraging in society, and their general attentiveness to their surroundings. This present commingles, however, with the rise of conservative politics, with the infiltration of the alt-right in the ecological and green movements, and harsh responses to figures like Greta Thunberg. So how do you suggest that we might carry out conversations about environmental change with people of all ages, some of whom might not be inclined to listen?
It's very worrying that the environmental movement, in a broad sense, is currently being split by exactly the same splits that are splitting everything else between liberalism and ultra-right conservatism. I was very worried to read, for example, reports to the extent to which the alt-right in Germany has infiltrated the Green Party there, and you can see how there are aspects of environmentalism that suit the alt-right, the conservative position very well. Sense of ties to the soil, and maintaining and valuing the past and the traditions and a lot of things, not all of which are intrinsically bad, which resonate with both a green agenda and a conservative agenda. And on the other hand, we have the problem that people like Greta Thunberg, a child of an affluent, we're highly educated family in Sweden, is representing the meritocratic liberal elite, and who are just telling us we know how everything is, and you need to understand because you're uneducated, you lot. And an awful lot of the climate protesters have been people, white middle class, well-educated people going along just to show how virtuous they are. So the movement is getting split a bit between these two factions, and that's very harmful. But one of the beautiful things about very young and very old people is that they haven't tied their lives to dogma or to the defense of positions in the same way that the intermediate generation does. They tend to be kind of fairly open about things, even perhaps phlegmatic. But the last thing we want is people who want to attach their flag to a cause. What we do want is people who are actually sensitive enough to pay some attention to what's going on around them. So again, I think that if we allowed that the very young and the very old are actually the people who are laying down a path for the future, then there's less of a risk of things becoming imprisoned within either neoliberal or right-wing agendas. But again, how you achieve it is difficult. If we knew the answers, we'd be doing it.
Tim, thank you so much. We'll take from this conversation the idea that the word for weather and time in many languages is the same, that we might nurture a different relationship to time by bringing together the younger and the older generations in collaboratively forging the future, that we might reconsider the roles, our roles in the here and now, and make different demands for tomorrow. So thank you so much for these thoughts and for connecting with us today.
Bye-bye.